What would you do if a single, desperate moment changed everything you thought you knew about love? Grace never imagined that asking a stranger to pretend to be her boyfriend would lead to the most genuine connection of her life. In the bustling heart of Los Angeles, an impulsive request to avoid her ex became the beginning of something she never saw coming. Sometimes the most beautiful truths begin with the most innocent lies. But what happened next? No one there could have imagined. If this story moves you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your support is what keeps this channel alive. Grace stopped on the sidewalk, her heart racing as if she had just run a marathon. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the strap of her bag, eyes fixed on the entrance of the cafe ahead. Through the fogged glass, she could see the silhouettes of customers, the steam from the coffee machines creating a cozy haze that sharply contrasted with the panic she felt inside. Then she saw him. Brandon. He was there, across the street, walking toward her with that confident smile she knew so well. The same smile that once made her sigh with passion, but now only stirred a bitter mix of anger and sadness. She wasn't ready for this. Not today, not alone, not after everything that had happened between them. Panic took over. Grace turned quickly, searching for an escape route, but her legs seemed to have lost all coordination. Then her eyes landed on a man standing near the cafe entrance. Tall, elegant, wearing a dark blazer that fit his athletic frame perfectly. There was something in his posture that radiated confidence without arrogance, a natural calm that drew her in instantly. Without thinking twice, Grace hurried toward him. "Excuse me, I know this is going to sound completely crazy," she began, her words spilling out almost desperately, "but would it be possible for you to pretend to be my boyfriend for a few minutes?" The man raised an eyebrow, a playful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. His eyes were a deep, almost hypnotic blue, and Grace felt as if he could see right through all her anxiety. "Pretend to be your boyfriend?" he repeated, his voice deep and smooth with an accent she couldn't place. "That's definitely a unique approach." Grace blushed, realizing how absurd she must sound. I know it's strange, but my ex is coming this way and I really don't want to face him alone. Please, it's just a few minutes. I'll explain later, I promise." He tilted his head, studying her for a moment that felt like an eternity. Grace could see Brandon getting closer, and her desperation began to turn into pure panic. "Please," she whispered, something so vulnerable in her voice that it made his chest tighten. "All right," he said finally, extending his hand to her. "I'm Charles, and apparently I'm your boyfriend now." "Grace," she replied, feeling an immense relief flood her chest. "Thank you so much. You have no idea how much this means to me." Charles interlaced his fingers with hers, and Grace was struck by the sense of security this simple touch brought. There was something comforting in the firmness of his hand, in the way his fingers fit perfectly with hers. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, stepping closer with a natural ease that left her breathless. Before Grace could respond, the familiar voice of Brandon echoed behind them. "Grace? Grace, is that you?" She turned slowly, feeling Charles gently squeeze her hand in a supportive gesture. Brandon stood just a few meters away, wearing that surprised expression she knew so well. "Hi, Brandon," she managed to say, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Wow, what a coincidence running into you here," Brandon continued, his eyes shifting between her and Charles with obvious curiosity. "Kahatu, you okay?" It was then that Charles stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Grace in a protective gesture that felt completely natural. "Sorry, we don't know each other," Charles said, extending his free hand to Brandon with a polite yet firm smile. "I'm Charles, Grace's boyfriend." The shock on Brandon's face was instant and satisfying. Grace felt a mix of gratitude and something deeper growing in her chest as she watched Charles take on the role with a confidence that left her speechless. "Boyfriend?" Brandon repeated, clearly shaken. "Grace, you didn't tell me that you were—" "I don't think I owe you the details of my personal life," Grace cut in, surprising herself with her assertiveness. Charles's presence by her side seemed to awaken a courage she didn't know she had. Charles draped his arm around her shoulder, gently pulling her closer. The gesture was so natural, so intimate, that for a moment Grace forgot this was all just an act. "I hope you understand," Charles said to Brandon, his tone cordial but unmistakably firm. "Grace and I had plans for this afternoon." Brandon lingered, clearly uncomfortable, his gaze shifting between the two of them. Grace could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he tried to process the scene before him. "So of course," he murmured finally. Maybe we'll talk later, Grace." "Maybe," she replied, her voice stronger now. Brandon nodded, cast one last confused look at Charles, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd on the busy sidewalk. Grace let out a long, deep breath, feeling as if she had been holding it for hours. "Wow," she whispered, still processing what had just happened. "That was intense." Charles looked at her, and there was something different in his eyes now, something softer and genuinely interested. "You're okay?" he asked, and Grace realized that the concern in his voice was real. She nodded, suddenly aware that his arm was still around her shoulders, how safe and protected she felt there. "Thank you," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "Really, thank you so much. You were perfect." Charles smiled, and Grace felt something stir in her stomach, something entirely unrelated to the nervousness of facing Brandon. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Grace," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made her heart race again. But this time it wasn't fear. It was something completely different, something she hadn't expected to feel when asking a stranger for help on the street. It was interest. Genuine, unexpected interest in this mysterious man who had appeared at exactly the moment she needed him most, and for the first time in months, Grace wondered what else could happen if she didn't let this story end here. The silence that followed Brandon's departure seemed to carry electricity in the air. Grace remained there, still enveloped by Charles's protective arm, feeling the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of her blouse. His masculine scent, something between wood and spices, flooded her senses in a way that made her feel slightly dizzy. "He seems surprised, but okay," Charles remarked, his low voice carrying a playful tone. Grace laughed, a nervous sound that escaped before she could stop it. Surprised is an understatement. Brandon definitely didn't expect that. Charles finally loosened his arm, but didn't step away completely. His blue eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and protected at the same time. "Can I ask what happened between you two?" he asked gently. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but..." He seemed genuinely shaken. Grace sighed, running a hand through her dark hair. "Brandon and I broke up 3 months ago. It was complicated. He cheated on me with a co-worker, and when I found out, he said it was just a mistake, that he loved me and we could get past it together." "But you couldn't forgive him," Charles added, not as a question, but as a gentle statement. "It wasn't just about forgiveness," Grace explained, feeling a strange need to open up to this man she had just met. "It was about trust, about respect, about how he thought he could have me back just by saying the right words. As if I were a prize he could reclaim." Charles nodded, and there was something in his expression that showed genuine understanding. "And today? Were you avoiding a confrontation, or..." "I was avoiding feeling small again," Grace admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Brandon has this ability to make me question myself, to make me feel like maybe I had been too harsh, too rigid, and I didn't want to go through that again." "But you didn't seem small a moment ago," Charles observed, an admiring smile touching his lips. "You seemed strong, determined." Grace looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since she had run toward him. Charles was undeniably handsome, but there was something deeper to his beauty. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence he exuded, the way his eyes seemed to truly see her. "That's because you were there," she said softly. "It was easier to be brave when I wasn't alone. Maybe you've always had that courage," he suggested, and just needed a reminder. The moment was interrupted when Brandon reappeared, approaching them with hesitant steps. Grace felt her stomach tighten, but Charles's solid presence at her side kept her courage intact. "Grace, sorry to interrupt, but can I talk to you for a minute, alone?" Before Grace could respond, Charles took an almost imperceptible step forward, creating a subtle but clear barrier between Brandon and her. "Actually," Charles said, his voice polite, but with undeniable firmness, "Grace and I were about to go in for a coffee, right, love?" The word love slipped naturally from his lips, sending a shiver down Grace's spine. She looked at Charles, seeing the way he regarded Brandon, not with hostility but with a silent authority that made it clear he wouldn't allow any discomfort for her. "Yes," Grace managed to say, her voice firmer than she expected. "We have plans, Brandon." Brandon seemed to process the rejection, his face passing through a series of expressions: surprise, frustration, and finally, reluctant acceptance. "All right," he murmured. "But Grace, if you change your mind, you have my number." "She does," Charles replied for her, "but I doubt she'll need it." There was something in the way Charles spoke, not arrogant or provocative, but with a calm certainty, that made Brandon visibly step back. Grace found herself impressed by his ability to be protective without being aggressive, firm without being rude. Brandon looked at Grace one more time, as if expecting her to say something, but she remained silent. Finally, he nodded and walked away, this time without looking back. "Wow," Grace breathed as Brandon disappeared into the crowd. "You're really good at that." Charles laughed, a rich, genuine sound. "Pretending to be women's boyfriends? I can't say I have much experience." Grace felt her cheeks heat at the casual comment about her beauty. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel truly seen, appreciated in a way Brandon never could, not even at his best. "You were perfect," she said, then hesitated. I don't know how to thank you properly." "How about starting with that coffee?" Charles suggested, gesturing toward the cafe. "Not pretending this time, but for real. I'd like to get to know you better, Grace." There was something in the way he said her name that made her feel as if it were the first time someone had truly pronounced it. As if he had discovered a hidden music in the two simple syllables. "I'd love to," she replied, surprised by the sincerity in her own voice. When Charles extended his hand to her again, Grace took it without hesitation. This time there was no urgency or desperation. It was a conscious choice, a genuine desire to extend this unexpected moment. As they walked toward the cafe, Grace found herself glancing at Charles from the corner of her eye. The way he moved with quiet confidence, the polite way he greeted the doorman who opened the door for them, the way his presence seemed to command respectful attention from those around. There was something more to this man, she realized, something beyond kindness and superficial charm, a depth that intrigued her and at the same time slightly frightened her. When they sat at a corner table, away from the street's hustle, Grace looked directly at Charles and allowed herself to ask the question that had been echoing in her mind since the first moment. "Who are you really, Charles?" He smiled, but there was something mysterious in his blue eyes, a suggestion of untold secrets. "That," he said, "is an interesting story. But first tell me about you, Grace. Who is the woman who ran toward a complete stranger and asked him to pretend to be her boyfriend?" And as Grace began to speak, she couldn't help but wonder if this conversation would change everything she thought she knew about chance, destiny, and the way two lives could intertwine at the most unexpected moment. The cafe was a cozy refuge from the chaos of Los Angeles. The rich aroma of freshly roasted coffee mingled with the soft hum of low conversations and the gentle clinking of cups against saucers. Grace found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, seated across from Charles at a rustic wooden table with the golden afternoon light filtering through the large windows. "So," Charles said, slowly stirring sugar into his espresso, "a woman asking strangers for help on the street. Does that suggest courage or desperation?" Grace laughed, a genuine musical sound that made Charles lift his eyes from his coffee with renewed interest. "Definitely desperation. I don't usually approach men on the street asking for bizarre favors." "What a shame," he murmured, with a mischievous smile. "I imagined it might be your usual flirting strategy." "My flirting strategy?" Grace almost choked on her cappuccino. "You think this was—" Charles leaned slightly forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Wasn't it? Because it was quite effective." Heat rose up Grace's neck, tinting her cheeks a soft pink that Charles found utterly charming. There was something about her vulnerability, the way she shifted between confidence and shyness, that completely fascinated him. I wasn't," she stammered, trying to form a coherent sentence. "Grace," Charles said gently, "I'm teasing you, relax." She sighed, running a hand through her dark hair. "Sorry, I'm still a little shaken by everything. Meeting Brandon, asking a stranger for help, pretending to have a boyfriend. It's not exactly a normal day for me. And what are your normal days like? Charles asked, genuinely curious. Grace cupped her coffee, absorbing the warmth. I work at a small bookstore downtown. I wake up early, have coffee at home, walk to work, spend the day organizing books and helping customers find their next literary adventures. I come home, make dinner, read a little, sleep. Repeat. Sounds peaceful, Charles observed. Boring, you mean? Grace corrected with a self-deprecating smile. Actually, it sounds honest, Charles said, his voice carrying a seriousness that surprised her. There's something refreshing about a life without unnecessary complications. Grace studied him for a moment. You speak as someone who knows unnecessary complications well. Charles smiled enigmatically. Maybe I do. Your turn, Grace said, resting her chin in her palm, mirroring his posture. What are your normal days like? Charles hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Meetings, lots of meetings, decisions that affect other people, responsibilities that sometimes weigh heavier than I'd like. That's delightfully vague, Grace commented with a smile. What exactly do you do? Family business, he replied, and Grace noticed the brief flicker of avoidance in his gaze. Nothing too exciting. Everyone thinks your work isn't exciting, she said, but I'd bet there's more there than you're letting on. Charles looked at her with renewed interest. You're observant. It comes from my work. You learn to read people when you spend your day helping them pick books. People reveal a lot about themselves through the genres they choose, the questions they ask. And what does my choice to help a stranger on the street reveal about me? Charles asked, leaning closer. Grace felt her heart quicken with the closeness. She could see small lines around his eyes, hints of frequent smiles, and a subtle scar near his left eyebrow. It shows you're kind, she said softly, and unafraid of unusual situations, that perhaps you enjoy a little unpredictability in life. Very perceptive, Charles murmured, and there was something in his voice that made Grace shiver pleasantly. And you, he continued, what does your choice to ask a stranger for help reveal? Grace considered. That I'm braver than I think, and maybe tired of facing everything alone. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable but carried mutual understanding. Grace found herself looking at Charles very differently than she had when she had approached him desperately on the street. Now she saw the intelligence in his eyes, the way he truly listened when she spoke, how his smiles seemed genuinely prompted by her words. May I confess something? Charles said suddenly. Grace nodded, curious. When you approached me on the street, my first instinct was to politely refuse and continue walking. What made you change your mind? Grace asked, unsure if she really wanted the answer. Charles was silent for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. There was something in your eyes, not just desperation but strength, like you were fighting against something bigger than just an unwanted encounter with an ex. Grace felt her chest tighten. And you wanted to help. I wanted to meet you, he corrected gently. The woman brave enough to ask for help yet proud enough to hesitate in doing so. How did you know I was hesitant? Charles smiled. The way you apologized 3 times before even making the request. The slight tremor in your hands. You were doing something entirely against your nature, and it intrigued me. Grace was speechless. No one had ever read her so easily, so accurately. Brandon, even after 2 years together, had never understood her with such clarity. And now, she asked, her voice almost a whisper, still intrigued. Charles reached across the table, gently touching her hand. The contact was electric, sending warmth up Grace's arm. Grace looked at his hand covering hers. Strong, with long, elegant fingers but subtle calluses, hinted he wasn't just a desk-bound man. Charles, she began, then hesitated. What is it? Is this real? I mean, not the Brandon situation, but this? She gestured between them. Or are we still pretending? Charles turned her hand, intertwining their fingers. Grace, I can promise you I'm no longer pretending. For a moment, the world around them seemed to vanish. The cafe chatter, the traffic outside, even concern for Brandon. All faded, leaving only the two of them, connected by something neither expected to find. I should go, Grace said suddenly, but made no move to rise. Should? Charles asked, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. Yes, because what we're doing, is dangerous. Dangerous how? Grace looked him directly in the eyes. Because it's been so long since anyone looked at me the way you're looking at me now, and I don't know if I'm ready for what that could mean. Charles gently squeezed her hand but didn't let go. And what if I told you I'm not sure I'm ready either? That this is as unexpected for me as it is for you? Grace felt something inside her chest melting, a resistance she hadn't even realized she was holding. Then perhaps, she said slowly, we can figure it out together. I have a proposal, Charles said, his eyes sparkling with a mischievous energy Grace hadn't seen before. How about we continue this fake relationship for a few more hours? Grace nearly choked on the last sip of her cappuccino. What do you mean? Well, he leaned back in his chair, a playful smile curling his lips. Technically, we're still a couple, aren't we? At least until we're sure your ex won't show up again. It would be a shame to waste such a convincing performance. You're suggesting we keep pretending? Grace asked, though there was something in her voice that hinted she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. I'm suggesting we enjoy an afternoon in Los Angeles and see where it leads, Charles replied, standing and extending his hand to her. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who met in an unusual way exploring the city together. Grace looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face. There was something irresistible in the spontaneity of his proposal, in the way Charles seemed to live in the moment, without worrying too much about consequences. All right, she said, taking his hand. But if this goes wrong, it's your fault. I fully accept responsibility, Charles laughed, helping her to stand. They left the cafe together, and Grace was surprised at how easily their steps synchronized. Charles suggested walking to Venice Beach, and she agreed, curious to see what kind of person he was away from the tense encounter with Brandon. The walk to the beach was a revelation. Charles was funny in a clever, subtle way, making keen observations about the people passing by, sharing stories that made her laugh genuinely. There was a lightness to him that contrasted with the seriousness she had noticed when he talked about work. See that man over there? Charles discreetly pointed to a middle-aged man in a formal suit on the beach, speaking angrily into his phone. $5 says he's arguing about the tablecloth colors for his daughter's wedding. Grace watched the man gesturing dramatically. You're crazy. He's obviously closing some important deal. Want a bet? Charles challenged. They strolled closer, pretending to admire the ocean while trying to overhear the conversation. Dad, I don't care if it's ivory or eggshell, Sarah. To me, they're both white, the man exclaimed. Grace covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Charles gave her a look that said, I told you so, which made her laugh even more. How did you know? She asked as they walked away. Instinct, Charles shrugged. That's the face of a man who just realized there's a difference between 17 shades of white. They bought ice cream from a street vendor and walked along the sand, taking off their shoes and letting the cold ocean water touch their feet. Grace couldn't remember the last time she had done something so spontaneous, simple, and genuinely fun. Can I ask you something? Grace said, absent-mindedly licking her strawberry ice cream. Ask anything. Why did you do that? Help a complete stranger, I mean. Most people would have run away. Charles stopped walking, looking at the horizon where the sun was tilting toward the ocean. Honestly, it's been a long time since I've done anything spontaneous. My life is predictable. Scheduled meetings, business dinners, social events where everyone talks about the same things. When you approached me, it was like someone opened a window in a stuffy room. Grace felt something stir in her chest at his honesty. And now, do you still feel that way? Charles turned to look at her, something intense in his blue eyes. Now I feel like I went for a walk and found a hidden treasure. The comment made her blush, but also sparked a courage she didn't know she had. Careful with the compliments, Mr. Mysterious. I might start believing them. You should, he said simply, and the seriousness in his voice made her pause. They stood there on the sand, the ocean whispering around their ankles, looking at each other with an intensity that made Grace forget how to breathe for a moment. Charles, she began, but a larger wave caught them by surprise, soaking their clothes up to their knees. Grace screamed in shock, losing her balance on the slippery sand. Charles grabbed her arm, pulling her against his chest to prevent her from falling completely. For a moment they stood like that, pressed together, Grace's hands resting on his chest, Charles's arms around her waist. She could feel his heartbeat racing under her palms, see every detail of his face just inches from hers. "Thank you," she whispered, but neither of them moved away. "Grace," Charles murmured, his voice husky. "Yes? May I kiss you? For real this time?" Grace's heart raced. She thought of Brandon, how he never asked, just took. She thought of how safe and desired she felt in Charles's arms, how he made her laugh, how he looked at her as if she were something precious. "Yes," she whispered. The kiss was different from the one in front of the cafe. That one had been performative, convincing. But this was real. Soft at first, almost hesitant, then deeper as Grace responded, entwining her arms around his neck. When they pulled apart, both were breathing unevenly. "Wow," Grace murmured. "Yeah," Charles agreed, gently stroking her cheek with his thumb. "Definitely not pretending anymore." Grace laughed, a low, musical sound. "Definitely not." They walked back along the beach in a comfortable silence, but Grace kept sneaking glances at Charles. There was something different in the way he moved, a natural confidence beyond mere security. People greeted them along the way. The ice cream vendor waved as if he had known Charles for years. A group of surfers called out something friendly in their direction. "You're popular here," Grace observed. Charles gave an enigmatic smile. "I come here often. People know me." There was something in his response that piqued Grace's curiosity, but before she could ask more, Charles's phone rang. "Sorry," he said, glancing at the screen. "I need to take this." "Of course." He stepped a few paces away, and Grace could overhear fragments of his conversation. "Can't wait until tomorrow. I understand the urgency, but she doesn't need to know yet. When the time is right." Grace pretended to study the menu, but her mind raced. Family business, board meetings, investors, people who treated him with special deference. Who was Charles, really? When he returned to the table, tension was visible in his face, though he tried to mask it with a smile. "Sorry about that," he said, sitting down. "Sometimes work doesn't respect schedules." "Charles," Grace said carefully, "may I ask you something? And could you be completely honest with me?" He looked into her eyes, and for a moment she saw a flicker of vulnerability there. "Of course. Are you just an employee in your family's business, or is there something more you're not telling me?" Charles was silent for a long moment, staring at his interlaced hands on the table. Grace could see the internal struggle playing across his expression. "Grace," he began slowly, "my life is complicated. There are responsibilities, expectations, pressures that sometimes make it hard to know who I really am versus who people expect me to be." "That doesn't answer my question," Grace said gently but firmly. Charles looked directly into her eyes. "No, it doesn't. And I'm sorry. It's just that I haven't met anyone in a long time who looks at me the way you do." "And how do I look at you?" "As if I were just Charles. Not what I do, not what I have, not the expectations or responsibilities. Just me." Grace felt her heart tighten at the raw honesty in his voice. "And is that rare for you?" "Rarer than you can imagine." They were interrupted by the waiter bringing tacos, giving Grace a moment to process what Charles had said. There was a profound loneliness in his words, a hint that his life was full of people, but lacking genuine connection. "Charles," she said once Miguel walked away, "I don't care what you do or how much money you have. What matters is the person who spent the entire afternoon making me laugh, who held my hand when the waves almost knocked me over, who kissed me as if I were the only person in the world at that moment." Charles paused mid-bite, looking at her with an intensity that made her feel as if he were memorizing every detail of her face. "Grace," he said softly, "you have no idea what it means to hear that." "Then why do I feel like you're holding back, even while being here?" Charles reached across the table, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Because I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That when you discover the truth about my life, about who I really am, you'll realize we're from very different worlds. And I can't bear to see disappointment in your eyes when you look at me." Grace squeezed his hand. "And if I told you the only thing that would disappoint me is if you didn't trust me enough to let me decide for myself?" Charles was silent for a long moment, the internal war visible on his face. Finally, he sighed deeply. "Tomorrow night," he said. "Can I show you something? Something that will explain everything. All right, Grace agreed, though part of her was nervous about what she might discover. Charles lifted her hand to his lips, gently kissing her knuckles. Thank you for being patient with me. As they finished their dinner beneath the emerging stars, Grace couldn't help but wonder what she had gotten herself into. But looking at Charles, seeing the genuine gratitude in his eyes, she knew she was willing to find out. Whatever his secret was, she felt it was worth the risk. The sun was beginning to set as Charles and Grace walked back along the Venice Beach boardwalk. The lights from the restaurants and shops were starting to turn on, creating a magical atmosphere that made Grace feel as if she were living in a dream. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so alive, so present in the moment. "Are you hungry?" Charles asked, stopping in front of a small Mexican restaurant with outdoor tables. "This place has the best fish tacos in the city." "How do you know that?" Grace asked, amused. "Do you really know every corner of Los Angeles?" "Only the best ones," Charles replied with a mysterious smile. They sat at a table overlooking the ocean, and Grace noticed how the waiter greeted Charles warmly. "Mr. Whitmore, what a pleasure to see you again," the young waiter said in Spanish, then switched to English. "Your usual table?" "This one's perfect, Miguel." "Thank you," Charles replied, and Grace realized he had answered in fluent Spanish. When Miguel walked away to get the drinks, Grace leaned forward across the table. "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Charles seemed slightly uncomfortable for the first time all day. "Charles Whitmore. Sorry, I guess I didn't mention my last name earlier." "Whitmore," Grace repeated slowly. There was something familiar about the name, but she couldn't place it. "And you come here often enough to have a usual table?" "I like the simplicity of this place," Charles said, glancing away briefly. "It's authentic." Grace was about to ask more when an elegant, middle-aged woman approached their table. She was clearly well-dressed, wearing subtle yet expensive jewelry, and carried herself with a natural authority. "Charles, darling," she exclaimed, kissing both of his cheeks. "What a surprise to see you here. I thought you were in a meeting with investors tonight." Grace saw Charles stiffen almost imperceptibly. "Margaret, what a pleasure. I actually decided to postpone the meeting." Margaret looked curiously at Grace, clearly expecting an introduction. "Margaret, this is Grace," Charles said, placing his hand over hers on the table. "Grace, this is Margaret Sinclair, a family friend." "Pleased to meet you," Margaret said, but her eyes studied Grace in a way that made her feel as if she were being evaluated. "Charles rarely introduces us to his friends." "Likewise," Grace replied politely, though there was something in Margaret's tone that made her uncomfortable. "Well, I won't interrupt anymore," Margaret said, turning back to Charles. "But remember, darling, the board meeting is early tomorrow. Your father will be expecting the report." After Margaret walked away, Grace looked at Charles questioningly. "Board? What kind of family business exactly?" Charles sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated, Grace. Try to explain it to me simply then." Before Charles could answer, his phone rang again. This time he glanced at the screen and frowned. "Sorry, I need to take this. It's important." He walked a few meters away, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders as he spoke. Fragments of the conversation drifted toward her when the wind blew in the right direction. "Can't wait until tomorrow? I understand the urgency, but she doesn't need to know yet. When the right moment comes." Grace pretended to study the menu, but her mind was racing. Family business, board meetings, investors, people who knew him across the city and treated him with special deference. Who was Charles really? When he returned to the table, there was visible tension in his face that he tried to hide with a smile. "Sorry about that," he said, sitting down again. "Sometimes work doesn't respect schedules." "Charles," Grace said carefully, "can I ask you something? And could you be completely honest with me?" He looked into her eyes, and for a moment she saw a flicker of vulnerability there. "Of course. Are you just an employee in your family's business, or is there something more you're not telling me?" Charles was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the table. Grace could see the internal struggle across his expression. "Grace," he began slowly, "my life is complicated. There are responsibilities, expectations, pressures that sometimes make it hard to know who I really am versus who people expect me to be. That doesn't answer my question, Grace said gently but firmly. Charles looked directly into her eyes. No, it doesn't. And I'm sorry. It's just that I haven't met anyone in a long time who looks at me the way you do. And how do I look at you? As if I were just Charles. Not what I do, not what I have, not the expectations or responsibilities. Just me. Grace felt her heart tighten at the raw honesty in his voice. And is that rare for you? Rarer than you can imagine. They were interrupted by the waiter bringing the tacos, giving Grace a moment to process what Charles had said. There was a deep loneliness in his words, a suggestion that his life was full of people but empty of genuine connections. Charles, she said after Miguel walked away, I don't care what you do or how much money you have. What matters is the person who spent the entire afternoon making me laugh, who held my hand when the waves almost knocked me over, who kissed me as if I were the only person in the world at that moment. Charles paused mid-bite, looking at her with an intensity that made her feel as if he were memorizing every detail of her face. Grace, he said softly, you have no idea what it means to hear that. Then why do I feel like you're holding back from me even while being here? Charles reached across the table, intertwining his fingers with hers. Because I'm afraid. Afraid of what? That when you discover the truth about my life, about who I really am, you'll realize we come from very different worlds. And I can't bear the thought of seeing disappointment in your eyes when you look at me. Grace squeezed his hand. And if I told you the only thing that would disappoint me is if you didn't trust me enough to let me decide for myself. Charles was silent for a long moment, the internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he sighed deeply. Tomorrow night, he said, can I show you something? Something that will explain everything. All right, Grace agreed, though a part of her was nervous about what she might discover. Charles lifted her hand to his lips, gently kissing her knuckles. Thank you for being patient with me. As they finished their dinner under the stars beginning to appear in the sky, Grace couldn't help but wonder what she was getting herself into. But looking at Charles, seeing the genuine gratitude in his eyes, she knew she was willing to find out. Whatever his secret was, she felt it was worth the risk. I have a confession to make, Charles said, as they finished walking back along the boardwalk. The night sky over Los Angeles sparkled with thousands of lights, creating an almost cinematic backdrop. I don't want this night to end just yet. Grace felt a wave of warmth spread through her body at the honesty in his voice. Throughout dinner, she had noticed small details she couldn't ignore. The way other patrons glanced discreetly at Charles, how the restaurant manager personally ensured they received the best service, even how strangers seemed to recognize him. I don't either, she admitted, but I have to work early tomorrow and you said you have important meetings. And what if I told you I can fix that? Charles interrupted, stopping and turning to face her. Let me take you to dinner. Somewhere special this time. Grace hesitated. There was something in the intensity of his gaze that made her feel this would not be just another casual meal. Charles, we already had dinner. That was tacos on the beach, he said with a smile blending charm and determination. I'm talking about something different. Trust me. Grace looked at him, seeing the vulnerable hope in his blue eyes. Okay, but only if you promise me one thing. Anything. No more mysteries tonight. I want to meet the real Charles, not the edited version. Charles nodded slowly. Deal. They walked to where Charles had parked, and Grace was surprised to see a sleek black Aston Martin waiting. It wasn't ostentatious, but clearly expensive, the kind of car that suggested more than just family business. Nice car, she said casually, trying not to show how impressed she was. Practical for the city, Charles replied, though Grace noticed he seemed slightly uncomfortable with her comment. The restaurant he took her to was the kind of place Grace had only seen in magazines. Located on the top floor of a Beverly Hills skyscraper, it offered panoramic views of the city. The maitre greeted them by name, Charles's full name, and led them to a table on the terrace with a privileged view. Mr. Whitmore, what a pleasure to have you with us again, the maitre said with genuine deference. Your favorite table is, of course, available. Grace watched the interaction with growing curiosity. This was clearly not just a regular customer, it was someone important enough to receive VIP treatment without question. Thank you, Philippe, Charles said naturally. "This is Miss Grace. Please make sure she gets the best you have to offer." "Of course, sir." As they sat, Grace looked around the elegant environment. Other guests were clearly wealthy, women in designer dresses, men in tailored suits, the type of crowd that attended charity events and graced social pages. "Charles," she said carefully, "this place is impressive. You don't like it?" he asked, a note of anxiety in his voice that surprised her. "It's not that. It's just, well, it's very different from tacos on the beach." Charles laughed, but there was tension behind the sound. "I like both. I like the simplicity of tacos and the quality of this place. It doesn't have to be one or the other." The sommelier approached with a bottle of wine Grace was sure cost more than she earned in a week. "The 2015 Bordeaux you requested, sir," he said, pouring a small amount for Charles to taste. Grace watched Charles analyze the wine with the expertise of someone clearly accustomed to fine wines. There was a naturalness in his movements that spoke of years of experience with refinement. "Perfect, thank you," Charles approved, and the sommelier filled both their glasses. "So," Grace said once they were alone, "I'll assume you didn't choose this place just because of the view." Charles smiled, slightly awkward. "Maybe I wanted to impress you." "Why?" "The tacos on the beach already worked perfectly." "Because," Charles paused, looking out the window at the city lights below. "You're special, Grace, and I wanted you to know that this is important to me." Grace felt her heart race. "Charles, let me finish," he said, turning to look at her directly. "Today was the first day in a long time I felt like myself. Not completing tasks, not meeting expectations, not being what others need me to be, just being. And you think you need to bring me to an expensive place for me to understand that?" Charles laughed, genuinely amused. "When you put it that way, it sounds ridiculous." "A little," Grace agreed with a smile, "but also sweet, in a slightly over-the-top way." "Over the top? Charles, you could take me to a food truck, and I'd be just as impressed. What impresses me is the way you listen when I speak, how you held my hand when the waves came, how you made Brandon disappear without being rude. Those are the things that matter." Charles was silent for a long moment, studying her face. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "See through everything else and go straight to what really matters." Grace shrugged. "Maybe it's because I don't have much everything else to distract me." "Tell me about your dreams," Charles said suddenly, changing the subject in a way that caught her off guard. "My dreams?" "Yes. What do you want in life? If you could have anything, do anything, what would it be?" Grace hesitated, unused to people asking about her ambitions so directly. "Well, I've always wanted my own cafe. A small, cozy place where people could come not just for coffee, but to feel at home. With bookshelves, soft music, maybe some outdoor tables for beautiful days like today." Charles leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Tell me more. I know it sounds simple compared to, well, corporate businesses and that kind of thing, but I've always imagined a place where I could combine two things I love, books and the way good coffee makes people feel welcomed." "It doesn't sound simple," Charles said seriously. "It sounds perfect. Have you ever thought about making it happen?" Grace laughed, but there was a note of sadness. "Charles, you've seen where I work. Bookstore employees don't exactly have the capital to start a business. And if they did?" There was something in the way he asked that made Grace look at him more intently. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if money weren't an obstacle, would you do it? Really try?" "Of course," Grace replied without hesitation. "In a heartbeat." Charles nodded slowly, as if carefully processing her words. "Grace, can I ask something personal? More personal than lifelong dreams. Have you ever wondered why things happen when they do? Why you needed help today, exactly at the moment I happened to pass by?" Grace considered the question. "Do you believe in destiny?" "I'm beginning to," Charles said softly. They were interrupted by the waiter bringing the first course, but Grace couldn't stop thinking about the intensity of the conversation. There were layers to Charles she was only beginning to discover, each one intriguing her more. As the night progressed, she found herself noticing small details, how other patrons discreetly looked at their table, how the staff addressed Charles with deference that went beyond standard high-quality service. "Charles," she finally said as they finished dessert, "may I make an observation?" Of course. People treat you as if you're important, not just rich, but important. Charles paused, setting his fork down carefully. And does that bother you? It doesn't bother me. It intrigues me, because you clearly don't want it to matter to me. It's not that, Grace. It's just, when people know who I am, they stop seeing me. They see what I represent, what I can do for them, how they can benefit from a connection with me. But you look at me as just a man. You are just a man, Grace said simply. A man who makes me laugh, who makes me feel safe, who listens as if my words truly matter. The rest, whatever it is just context. Charles reached across the table, intertwining his fingers with hers. Tomorrow night, he said, I'll show you all the context. And then you can decide if the man is still worth everything that comes with him. Grace squeezed his hand. And if I tell you the answer is already yes? Then I'll hope you still feel that way tomorrow night. As they left the restaurant, Grace wondered what kind of life Charles led that made him doubt someone could like him for who he was, rather than what he had. More importantly, what would she discover tomorrow that could change everything between them? Charles' house wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Grace sat in silence on the passenger seat of the Aston Martin as they climbed the winding road through the hills of Beverly Hills, passing wrought iron gates and tall walls that hid properties she had only seen in Hollywood movies. Charles, she said slowly as he stopped in front of an electronic gate with a discreet sign reading Whitmore Private Estate. You live here? Technically, it's one of the family homes, he replied, a tension in his voice. I use this one when I need space. The gate opened silently, and they entered a driveway flanked by perfectly manicured gardens. The mansion that appeared before them was a flawless example of modern architecture, with clean lines, massive glass panels, and a sense of elegance that impressed without being ostentatious. Grace stepped out of the car in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what she was seeing. It wasn't just the size, it was the quality, the attention to detail, the kind of place that spoke of generations of wealth and power. Grace, Charles said softly, standing beside her. Are you okay? She turned to look at him, and for the first time since they met, she saw real vulnerability in his eyes. I don't know yet, she admitted honestly. Charles ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervousness. Want to come inside? I can explain everything. The main living room was a study in understated elegance. Artworks that Grace suspected were originals adorned the walls, and custom furniture created intimate conversation spaces within the expansive room. Enormous windows offered panoramic views of Los Angeles, stretching all the way to the ocean. Drink? Charles offered, moving toward a bar that looked professionally stocked. I think I'll need one, Grace murmured, still processing her surroundings. Charles poured 2 glasses of wine, the same Bordeaux they had at the restaurant, she realized, and joined her on the sofa. A cautious distance separated them, one that had been absent all day. How many properties like this does your family own? Grace asked, accepting the glass. A few, Charles answered vaguely, then sighed. Grace, I need to tell you about my family, about who we are. She nodded, bracing herself for what was coming. My grandfather founded Whitmore Industries 60 years ago, Charles began, staring into his glass instead of at her. It started as a small construction company and over decades expanded into real estate development, hospitality, technology. Today, we are one of the largest private corporations on the West Coast. Grace felt her stomach tighten. And you? I'm the heir apparent, CEO in training. My father is preparing me to take full control in the coming years. CEO, Grace repeated slowly, of one of the largest corporations on the West Coast. Grace, how many employees? She interrupted. About 15,000? Family net worth? Charles hesitated. Does it matter? Answer the question, Charles. Billions, he said quietly. Multiple billions. Grace set her glass on the coffee table and walked to the enormous windows. The view was breathtaking, but her mind could barely process it, racing to connect dots she had ignored all day. That's why people recognize you, she finally said. That's why the special treatment everywhere. That's why you speak fluent Spanish, know fine wines, and have a regular table in restaurants where one meal costs more than I make in a week. Grace, please, let me explain. She turned to face him. Explain what? How you lied to me all day? I didn't lie, Charles defended, rising and stepping closer. Everything I told you about myself, about how I feel, about today being special, everything is true. But you left out a pretty important detail, didn't you? Grace felt tears of frustration threaten to spill. Charles, I'm a bookstore clerk. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in a building with no elevator. My car is 15 years old and sometimes won't start on the first try. I am what? Charles asked, hurt in his voice. From another world, Grace said, the words harsher than she intended. Charles froze mid-room as if she had slapped him. Is that how you see me now? As someone from another world? I don't know how to see you, Grace admitted, her voice breaking slightly. Yesterday you were an intriguing mystery. Today I found out you are Charles Whitmore. How am I supposed to feel? Like I'm doing some anthropological study? Like you're playing charity? Grace, no, Charles said, urgency in his voice. It was nothing like that. It was the opposite. Then what was it? Grace asked, looking him in the eye. Explain to me, Charles, because I really don't understand. Why would a billionaire waste his time pretending to be in a relationship with a regular bookstore girl? Charles stayed silent for a long moment, the struggle evident on his face. Because, he finally said, his voice low and intense, you were the first person in years who looked at me and saw just a man. Not my last name, not my net worth, not the opportunities a connection with me could bring. You saw Charles, just Charles, but I didn't know who you really were. Exactly, Charles said, raw vulnerability in his tone. You didn't know, and yet you laughed at my jokes, let me hold your hand, kissed me like I was the only person in the world who mattered at that moment. Grace felt her heart tighten at the painful honesty in his words. Do you have any idea, Charles continued, what it's like to live a life where you never know if people like you or what you can do for them? Where every relationship, every friendship, every conversation is filtered through what you represent instead of who you are. Charles, I didn't want it to end, he confessed. For the first time in my adult life, someone made me feel normal, real, as if I were worthy of being loved for who I am, not what I have. Grace looked at him, seeing the deep loneliness he had hidden behind charm and confidence. But you lied by omission, all day long. Yes, Charles admitted, and I'm sorry. But Grace, I was desperate to prolong the feeling of being just a man who had met an amazing woman, not the Whitmore heir who had found someone else interested in status and money. You assumed I would care about those things. No, Charles said quickly. It's the opposite. I knew you wouldn't. And that terrified me, because it meant that when you learned the truth, you'd have to choose between liking me enough to handle all the baggage I bring or deciding we were too incompatible to work. Grace looked at him. Really looked. She saw the man who had held her hand on the beach, made her laugh, kissed her like she was precious. But she also saw the magnitude of his world, the complexity, the responsibilities and pressures she could barely comprehend. Charles, she said softly, I need time to process this. The disappointment and fear on his face almost made her change her mind immediately. How much time? He asked. I don't know, Grace replied honestly. This is too much. Charles nodded, though she could see how hard it was for him to accept. Can I at least drive you home? I'd rather call an Uber. Grace, please, let me at least do that. She looked at him once more, seeing the vulnerability he was trying to hide. Okay. The ride back was silent, both lost in thought. When Charles stopped in front of Grace's modest building, he turned to look at her. Grace, he said softly, everything I felt today was real. Completely real. I know, she replied, realizing it was true. That's part of the problem. She stepped out without looking back, but could feel his eyes on her as she walked toward the entrance. In the elevator, leaning against the wall, Grace finally let the tears fall. She didn't know if she was crying for the loss of the simplicity they had shared, or the fear that maybe, just maybe, she had found something too real, too important to let go. Grace hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Since the revelation at Charles's mansion, she had spent nights staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, replaying every moment they had shared. The problem wasn't that Charles had lied. Technically, he had never said he wasn't wealthy. The problem was that she didn't know how to process the vast difference between their worlds. It was Thursday morning when she was organizing the romance section at the bookstore and heard the doorbell ring. Without looking up from the books, she called out, "Good morning, can I help you with something?" "Actually, I was hoping we could talk." Grace froze. It was Brandon's voice. She turned slowly, finding her ex-boyfriend standing at the entrance of the store, wearing the suit she had always thought made him look more important than he really was. Now, after spending time with Charles, the suit seemed ordinary. "Brandon," she said, her voice more controlled than she expected. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see you," he said, approaching with that confident smile that used to disarm her defenses. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about what happened last week." "There's nothing to think about," Grace replied, going back to arranging the books. "You saw me with my boyfriend. End of story." "That's the problem, Grace," Brandon said, leaning on the counter in a way she recognized as his attempt to appear casual and charming. "I did some research on your new boyfriend." Grace stopped arranging the books, a chill running down her spine. "Research?" "Charles Whitmore," Brandon said the name like it was a trophy. "Do you know who he is, Grace? He's the heir to Whitmore Industries, estimated net worth $3 billion. "So what?" Grace asked, though her voice sounded less firm than she wanted. Brandon laughed, a sound she remembered hating. "So what?" "Grace, be realistic. A man like Charles Whitmore doesn't date bookstore clerks seriously. Whatever he's doing with you, it's not real." Anger rose in Grace's chest, but there was also a pang of insecurity she hated admitting. "You don't know anything about Charles or our relationship." "I know men like him have a type," Brandon continued, stepping closer. "And it's not, well, it's not you, Grace. Not that you aren't beautiful," he hurried to add, "but be practical. You're from completely different worlds." "Like you and me?" Grace shot back, surprised at the acidity in her own voice. Brandon seemed momentarily taken aback. "That's different. We grew up together, we have history, real connections, we understand each other." "Understand each other," Grace repeated, turning to fully face him. "Brandon, you cheated on me with your co-worker and then expected me to forgive because we had history. That's not understanding, that's thinking you can have me back whenever you want. Grace, I made a mistake. A stupid mistake that meant nothing. But we had something real, something built over time. That guy, he's just playing with you." Before Grace could respond, the doorbell rang again. Both turned and Grace felt her heart race when she saw Charles standing in the doorway. He wore a light blue shirt that highlighted his eyes and casual pants, but there was something in his posture that radiated quiet authority. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Charles said, his eyes shifting between Grace and Brandon with a carefully neutral expression. "Charles," Grace said, hating how surprised and slightly breathless she sounded. "Ah, the famous Charles Whitmore," Brandon said, extending his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Brandon Mills, nice to officially meet you." Charles shook the offered hand politely, but Grace could see the tension in his shoulders. "Likewise." "We were actually just talking about you," Brandon continued, and Grace felt her stomach tighten. "Brandon," she warned. "Nothing major," Brandon said with false casualness. "Just commenting on how interesting it must be for someone of your position to meet people from such different backgrounds." Grace saw Charles stiffen almost imperceptibly. "Indeed," he said in a dangerously calm voice. "Very enlightening." "I'm sure," Brandon went on, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was creating. "It must be refreshing to step outside your usual circle for a while." "Brandon, stop," Grace said firmly. "What I find interesting," Charles said, stepping slightly in front of Grace, "is how comfortable you seem talking about Grace's relationship as if she weren't here." Brandon blinked, clearly not expecting Charles to defend her. "I was just—" "You were being condescending," Charles interrupted, his voice polite yet firm enough to make Brandon take a step back. "Both to me and to her." Grace looked at Charles, seeing how he protected her without implying she couldn't defend herself. It was different from before. This time she could see he was genuinely annoyed, not just playing a role. "Look," Brandon said, trying to regain control, "I've known Grace for years. I know what's best for her." "No," Grace said, her voice cutting the air like a blade. "You don't." Both men turned to look at her, but Grace kept her eyes on Brandon. "You think you know me because we dated for 2 years," she continued. "But you never really saw me. Never asked about my dreams, never cared about the books I read, never supported anything that mattered to me. Grace, that's not fair. And now you have the audacity to come here and tell me someone can't genuinely care about me because I'm not his type." Grace felt anger empower her voice. "As if you know my type or his." Brandon looked between Grace and Charles, clearly realizing he had lost control. "Charles may be rich," Grace continued, "may come from a world different from mine, but in one day he made me feel more valued and seen than you ever did in 2 years." Charles looked at her, surprised, with something like gratitude. But Grace wasn't finished. "So no," she said to Brandon, "you don't know what's best for me, and frankly, I owe you no explanation about my life or my choices." Brandon stood silent for a moment, processing the clear rejection. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "All right, Grace, I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," she replied, and for the first time in days she truly believed it. After Brandon left, Grace and Charles were alone in the quiet store. Grace could feel Charles looking at her, but suddenly felt shy after her declaration. "Grace," Charles said softly, "thank you." "For what?" "For defending me. For saying I made you feel valued." Grace finally looked at him, seeing vulnerability in his blue eyes. "I didn't say it for you. I said it because it's true." Charles took a step toward her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What Brandon said about us being from different worlds, did it change anything for you? Confirm a fear you already had?" Grace considered the question carefully. "For a moment, yes, but then I realized he was trying to do exactly what he always did, make me question my own judgment." "And your judgment says?" Grace took a deep breath, making a decision she knew would change everything. "My judgment says maybe I've spent the last 3 days fearing the wrong thing." "What do you mean?" "I was afraid that we were too different to work," Grace explained. "But what I should have feared was letting fear stop me from seeing if we could." Charles smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen since the night at the mansion. "Grace Walker," he said, "you constantly surprise me." "Better get used to it," she replied, feeling braver than she had in days. And for the first time since learning the truth about Charles, Grace allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make it work. O silêncio na livraria parecia pesado, carregado de possibilidades. Grace podia ouvir cada som ao redor. O tic-tac do relógio antigo na parede, o murmúrio distante do tráfego nas ruas de Manhattan e, acima de tudo, o bater acelerado de seu próprio coração enquanto Charles se aproximava lentamente. Ele parou a poucos centímetros dela, e havia algo na tensão de seus ombros que denunciava noites mal dormidas, assim como ela. "Grace", ele começou, a voz baixa e intensa. "Estes foram os 3 dias mais longos da minha vida." Ela o encarou, realmente o encarou, pela primeira vez desde aquela revelação na mansão. Havia algo vulnerável nele, algo que não cabia nas capas de revistas ou nos negócios que comandava. Ela suspirou, quase inaudível. "Para mim também." Charles estendeu a mão hesitante, como pedindo permissão, e Grace, sem pensar, entrelaçou seus dedos com os dele. A sensação de completude que ela sentira nas ondas da praia voltou imediatamente, um lembrete de que certas conexões não podiam ser negadas. "Posso te contar algo?" Charles perguntou com aquele olhar que fazia o tempo parecer suspenso. Ela assentiu, curiosa e tensa. "Durante toda a minha vida", ele começou, "as pessoas sempre souberam quem eu era antes mesmo de me conhecerem. Meu nome abria portas, criava expectativas, mudava a dinâmica de qualquer sala em que eu entrasse. E por muito tempo, achei que isso fosse normal, que o mundo funcionasse assim." Grace percebeu a vulnerabilidade em seus olhos enquanto ele falava. Havia uma sinceridade que não podia ser fabricada, algo que nem mesmo seus bens poderiam comprar. "Então conheci você", continuou Charles, "e pela primeira vez, alguém me viu como homem, não como herdeiro, não como bilionário, não como oportunidade. Você viu, Charles e Grace? Isso foi intoxicante. Ela sentiu seu peito apertar diante de tanta honestidade. Charles, deixe-me terminar, ele pediu suavemente, apertando sua mão. Eu deveria ter te contado a verdade naquela primeira noite. Tinha medo de que você me olhasse diferente, de que tudo mudasse. Ela sentiu lágrimas se formarem, mas ele ainda falava, abrindo seu coração. Quando finalmente te contei, vi o que temia. Não ganância, não interesse súbito, mas distância. Uma parede que surgiu de repente. Porque havia, Grace admitiu baixinho. Eu não sabia como processar a magnitude de quem você é e quem eu sou. Mas eu não sou só Whitmore Industries, nem bilhões, nem mansões. Essas são circunstâncias da minha vida, não meu verdadeiro eu. Então quem você é? Ela perguntou, olhando-o nos olhos. Charlie sorriu, vulnerável e genuíno. Sou o homem fascinado por uma mulher corajosa que me pediu ajuda na rua. Sou o homem que descobriu que fazer alguém rir genuinamente é mais satisfatório do que qualquer negócio. Sou o homem que não quer que nenhum dia termine. Grace sentiu lágrimas rolarem livremente. Sou o homem que se apaixonou completamente, irrevogavelmente, por uma mulher que trabalha em uma livraria, que tem sonhos simples e lindos, que me faz querer ser melhor. Charles, ela sussurrou, mas ele não havia terminado. Se você me der uma chance real, Grace, vou mostrar todos os dias que você é a única coisa genuína que encontrei em anos. Não pelo que você pensa do dinheiro, mas pelo que sente por mim. As lágrimas finalmente caíram. Você está me dizendo que está apaixonado por mim? Completamente, irrevogavelmente, ele respondeu. Desde o momento que você riu do meu comentário sobre o homem do terno na praia, desde que me deixou segurar sua mão nas ondas, desde que me beijou como se eu fosse único. Grace riu entre lágrimas. Charles Whitmore, bilionário, se apaixonou por mim. Grace Walker, funcionária de livraria, se apaixonou por mim também, ele disse, quase sorrindo em pergunta. Ela o olhou, vendo a vulnerabilidade, a esperança e, finalmente, a verdade que ele oferecia. Sem segredos, sem jogos. Sim, ela sussurrou. Me apaixonei. Pelo homem que me fez rir, que me fez sentir segura, que me olha como algo especial. Não pelo herdeiro dos jornais de negócios, mas pelo Charles que segura minha mão como se fosse preciosa. O sorriso dele iluminou o ambiente como o sol após a tempestade. Mas se vamos fazer isso, Grace continuou confiante, tem que ser real, sem omissões, sem proteção, sem medo. Você quer conhecer tudo? Ele perguntou cauteloso. Sim, tudo. E vamos enfrentar juntos como parceiros iguais, com honestidade completa. Charles ergueu sua mão aos lábios, beijando gentilmente seus dedos. Grace Walker, você é extraordinária. Uma mulher que se apaixonou por um homem extraordinário, ela respondeu. Posso te beijar? De verdade, sem fingimentos. Sim. O beijo foi puro, honesto, cheio de promessas e vulnerabilidade. Pela primeira vez não havia encenação nem urgência, apenas eles. Agora? Grace perguntou, respirando irregularmente. Agora? Ele sorriu. Paramos de fingir que é temporário e começamos a construir algo real juntos. Mesmo com todos os obstáculos? Especialmente com todos os obstáculos, porque, Grace, tudo que vale a pena requer trabalho, e você, nós, valemos a pena. Ela sorriu, sentindo leveza no peito. Charles Whitmore, nossa aventura mais incrível começa agora. Nossa vida, ele corrigiu beijando-a novamente. Pela primeira vez, a mentira deu lugar à verdade, e ela era mais linda do que qualquer um poderia imaginar. The morning sun filtered through the bookstore windows as Grace arrived at work the next day, finding a small envelope slipped under the door. Her name was written in elegant handwriting she was already starting to recognize as Charles's. Inside was a simple card with a message that made her smile. Grace, yesterday you gave me something I didn't realize I had been searching for all these years. The chance to be loved for who I am, not what I have. Would you like to start over? This time with the complete truth between us. If the answer is yes, meet me at the cafe where it all began at 6 p.m. If not, I'll understand. Always yours, Charles. Grace pressed the card to her chest, feeling her heart race. The simplicity of the gesture, the vulnerability in his words, the way he left the choice entirely in her hands, all of it confirmed what she had decided the night before. She wanted to try. Really try. At 6 sharp, Grace pushed open the door of the same cafe where they had sat just a week earlier, though it felt like a lifetime ago. Charles was already there, seated at the same table, 2 cups of coffee in front of him. When he saw her, the smile that lit up his face was like sunrise. "You came," he said, standing to pull out her chair. "I said I would," Grace replied, sitting down. "Although I have to admit, I was nervous all day." "I was too," Charles admitted, sitting across from her. "Actually, I cancelled 3 meetings because I couldn't focus on anything but whether you would show up." Grace laughed. "You cancelled meetings for me?" "Grace," Charles said seriously, "I'd cancel a whole week of meetings if it meant an hour with you." She felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "This is intense for a new beginning." "Sorry," Charles said quickly. "I'm trying not to be too intense, but you make me feel things very intensely." "Don't apologize," Grace said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "I like the intensity, I'm just not used to it." Charles intertwined his fingers with hers, and Grace felt that sense of completeness again. "So," she said, "official restart. Hi, I'm Grace Walker. I work in a bookstore, live alone with my plant, Lily, which I'm slowly killing, and I have the impossible dream of opening my own cafe one day." Charles smiled, playing along. "Hi, Grace. I'm Charles Whitmore. I'm a CEO in training at a company my family built, live in a house far too big for one person, and until I met you, I thought I had forgotten how to dream about anything beyond spreadsheets and quarterly reports." "Pleasure to meet you officially, Charles," Grace said formally, then broke character laughing. "This is ridiculous." "It is," Charles agreed, "but it's also perfect, because this time, there are no secrets." "Speaking of no secrets," Grace said, becoming a little more serious, "I want you to tell me about your real life, responsibilities, pressures, what it really means to be with you." Charles nodded. "Where should I start?" "With a typical day," she said. Charles considered for a moment. "I wake up at 5:30 to work out before the day starts. By 7, I'm at the office, usually with 3 meetings before 9. I spend the day alternating between strategic decisions, reviewing reports, board meetings, and trying to balance my father's expectations with my own ideas about the company's direction. Sounds stressful." "It is," Charles admitted, "especially since my father and I don't always see eye to eye on the company's direction. He comes from a more traditional, conservative generation. I want to modernize, be more socially responsible, invest in sustainability. Sometimes that creates tension." Grace saw the frustration in his eyes. "And outside of work?" "Until a week ago, work was basically everything. Business dinners, charity events where the family's presence is expected, weekends reviewing contracts or traveling to explore new investments." Charles paused, looking at her. "Sounds lonely when I say it out loud." "Sounds like you forgot how to live your own life." "Exactly," Charles said softly, "until you reminded me what that feels like." Grace's heart tightened. "Charles, if we're together, how would this work? I mean, would our life be just business dinners and charity events?" "Not if you don't want it to be," Charles answered immediately. "Grace, one of the things that attracted me most to you is how you make me want to prioritize differently. For the first time in years, I want to leave the office on time, have free weekends, time for things that really matter. And your family? What will they think about us?" Charles hesitated. "Honestly, it'll be an adjustment. My parents are used to seeing me with women from a certain social background. But Grace, you'll win them over, just like you did me." Grace wasn't entirely sure, but she appreciated his confidence. "And you?" Charles asked. "How do you feel about all this? About being with someone whose life comes with so much context?" Grace took a deep breath. "Scared? Yes. Intimidated by meeting your parents, attending events where everyone knows more about wine than I do about anything? Absolutely. But Charles..." She stopped, looking directly into his eyes. "You make me feel brave. And if that's what being with you means, then that's what I want." Charles lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. Grace Walker, you are the most incredible woman I've ever met. You don't even know me yet, Grace protested, laughing. Then we have time for that, Charles said. All the time in the world. They spent the next 2 hours truly talking. Charles shared the pressure of being heir to an empire, how sometimes he felt like he was living someone else's life. Grace spoke of her fears of never being enough, how Brandon had undermined her confidence, how Charles made her feel valued in a completely new way. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said while sharing dessert. "Anything. Why weren't you afraid to tell me about your wealth? I mean, after hiding it for so long." Charles smiled. "Because you proved you could handle who I am when you thought I was just Charles. And if you can love me thinking I'm ordinary, maybe you can love me knowing I'm complicated." "Charles Whitmore," Grace said, "you were never ordinary. Rich or not, you are extraordinary." When they left the cafe, Charles hesitated on the sidewalk. "Grace, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Tomorrow night there's a charity event I need to attend. Nothing big, just a dinner to raise funds for children's literacy. Would you like to go with me? As my official date?" Grace felt her stomach tighten with nerves, but also excitement. That would be like introducing ourselves publicly? "It would be me introducing the woman I love to my world," Charles said simply. Grace looked at him, seeing the vulnerable hope in his eyes, and made a decision she knew would change everything. "Yes," she said, "I'd love to." The smile Charles gave her made every ounce of nervousness worth it. "Grace," he said, pulling her into a hug, "thank you for giving me a chance. For giving us a chance. Thank you for being worth the risk," she replied. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms on the sidewalk under the lights of Los Angeles, Grace knew they were beginning something challenging, complicated, and absolutely perfect. What had started as a desperate lie had transformed into the most beautiful truth of their lives. Sometimes the most transformative moments in our lives begin with the most desperate requests. Grace never imagined that an improvised lie on a sidewalk would become the most authentic truth she had ever lived. Charles discovered that being truly seen for who he is worth more than all the wealth he inherited. They learned that true love knows no class differences, bank accounts, or social status. It simply recognizes two souls that complete each other. In the end, it wasn't money that changed Grace, nor was it her simplicity that changed Charles. It was the courage to be vulnerable, to trust, to choose love even when it seemed impossible. And perhaps that is the magic of destiny. It finds us exactly when we need it most, disguised as what we least expect. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us, where are you listening from? Your support allows us to keep bringing stories like this to life.